Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox, and this week we're covering the effect of the election on sanctions and OFAC, the latest on big enforcement actions against three different companies, the challenges of corruption in California and South Africa, and Florida man's attempt to check a human as luggage. But first, Tom, how has your week been, and what do you think is the most interesting development?
So I've always enjoyed the week after Labor Day because in my former life as a trial lawyer, that kicked off the absolute sprint from Labor Day till about the week after Christmas. And so for me, it's we both work very hard and we both work through August, but September's just in my head, the starting point for the sprint towards the holidays. So I always get rejuvenated by the Labor Day weekend holiday, and I came in ready to rock and roll.
Amen. Yeah, I always think of this as finish line sprinting, although I do tend to finish the week before Christmas, or at least the day before, because we close in the Christmas holidays. So I'm looking forward to that already. Get me out some of that specialty Christmas bark. I'm ready.
So I'd like to start with a rare declination, Kristy. Boston Consulting Group got a declination, as reported by our good friends over at the Risk and Compliance Journal of the Wall Street Journal. It was a letter declination with some fairly standard language, but a couple of very interesting points I think everyone has picked up on. The first is the self-disclosure was deemed timely, although we don't know what that means. And it's probably, somewhat counterintuitive to say we got great information, but I can't tell you what it means. But the conduct went back as far as 2014. And and the declination letter said that Boston Consulting Group, or BCG as they're colloquially known, picked it up somehow. And then they turned that information over to the Department of Justice via self-disclosure. Matt Kelly speculated that he believes timely self-disclosure is now 120 days based upon what he saw in the Department of Justice Whistleblower Rewards pilot program. I don't know if it was that because obviously this self-disclosure was long before that went into effect, but I think that every compliance practitioner needs to understand that it's not self-disclosure, it's timely self-disclosure. We learned that from Albemarle with their 18 months between discovery and self-disclosure. So you need to quickly and efficiently intake information, whether it be hotline, whether it be someone going into your manager's office, whether it be picking up it on an email, triage it, get it to the right people, investigate it, get it to the decision makers, make a decision, and if self-disclosure is appropriate, self-disclose. That's point one. But point two, the one that I think everybody picked up on, was that there was significant consequences for the partners of the firm in Portugal who were involved in the bribery and corruption. And they actually did not simply lose or had money clawed back, they had equity clawed back. And this is the first time we've seen equity clawed back. Equity does not equate to stock. It is something different when you're in a partnership or an LLP. So I have to speculate that BCG had the right to remove that or take that equity back, because I don't think you can do it without a contractual right. So I'm going to speculate that right existed. But here's the question I wanted to pose to you, and here's what I've been thinking about. Typically, when we see something new or at least different in a enforcement action or a declination, that becomes the standard. So as far back for me as when we heard about targeted and effective training, not just training, but effective and targeted training, and everything that's going forward. So my question I want to pose to you is, taking back equity now a floor for successfully meeting the prong of clawbacks and holdbacks?
I mean, I think that that's a really interesting question, Tom. And obviously, the uniqueness of the fact this is a partnership, as you suggested, is very different than if it was just publicly traded stock. But I do think that as a clawback goes, this is a particularly profound one. And I think that it does signal the desire of the DOJ to have real consequences for people and for companies to show those real consequences via direct action against their most senior people that are involved in this. So I think that's an interesting question, whether it's a floor. I think it definitely is going to be an expectation that will provide reward and prove fruitful if they do have that. So I think that the bar, I'm sure that the white collar bar is paying a lot of attention to that because it's going to be something that might really help them if they're trying to get that declination, just like BCG was able to do.
The stock is, I think, different than equity in a partnership. I'm not enough of a, I'm not sure what kind of lawyer that would be, a securities lawyer, I guess,
Securities. Yeah.
to understand if you own stock, can that be taken back, number one? And two, if you have an option, can that be taken back? And I don't pretend to know the answer to either of those. Perhaps one of our listeners does, but that may be the next thing we see.
Well, we will see, and trust me, we will be tracking that on Two Gurus Talk Compliance. So, Tom, I'm going to switch over to a dangerous topic, but I'm going to try to keep it in the sanctions world. My first article comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it's titled "Tough U.S. Sanctions Are Here to Stay, Whether It's Harris or Trump." So this article takes a controversial stance, I think, that it doesn't matter who becomes the president, that they'll essentially do the same thing when it comes to sanctions enforcement, including Russia. So the author gets some really interesting points. He notes that sanctions are a low-cost way of forcing the government's will on the world. It's obviously much cheaper and politically popular to impose sanctions than, say, send military personnel or try to get through appropriations aid to one country or another. Sanctions also effectively deputize banks and private companies to turn in those people violating sanctions or to hand over critical information relating to national security. The author notes that the Biden administration turned up sanctions to an unprecedented level in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So his statistics were from 2017 to 21. The U.S. added an average of 815 targets to the sanctions list every year. But since 2020, okay, in that short period, over 2,500 targets have been added to the lists, which is obviously a marked expansion. Coming back to the current election, the article says Harris is likely to continue down the path of sanctioning Russia and other countries if she's president. And that Trump, while has spoken about being more ambivalent about sanctions, found them useful against Iran, and that Trump would more likely use the sanctions relief effort to end the war rather than to continue to move them upward, but that they would still be enforced. So, Tom, without getting too political, do you agree that the sanctions regime wouldn't noticeably change regardless of who wins, or do you think the author is incorrect about that?
Kristy, I think I can be either 100% political or 0% political, and the answer will be the same.
Okay.
I think trade sanctions are administration and even political party agnostic. We saw a huge increase during the Trump administration. I used to laugh at my friends. Okay, it's 11 a.m. What are you going to do at 2 today? But then it only got more intense during the Biden administration, which communicated to me that this is now a tool of the U.S. government in the Department of Treasury or in the Department of Commerce, and that it really doesn't matter who is in the White House. So I'm completely party agnostic, candidate agnostic, political agnostic on this point. I think it's only going to increase. And at some point, people like you and me are going to have to start, not have to start, we're going to be asked more and more about this because it's going to become more ubiquitous. It's going to be driven down the supply chain. It's going to be driven to companies who had not thought about these things before. And it's going to be driven down to who are your sub-suppliers and your sub-customers. So if I sell, it's one thing to sell to Dubai and worry about, is it going on to Iran? It's another thing to sell to France, who sells to Germany, who sells to Dubai, who sells to Iran. Well, when that truck with Tom's Ford Motor Company, and used cars is seen in a picture buzzing down in Iran, the Department of Commerce is really not going to care my non-nefarious original sale. They're going to come ask some very difficult and serious questions. And I think that's the direction we're going. So I completely agree with this. I completely say tough sanctions are here to stay, and it doesn't matter who is elected or really anything else about the election.
Wow. Okay. So I'm the complete agreeing. I hadn't really thought about the idea that it's really quite cheap and easy to say, hey, everybody, you can't do business over here versus things like sending our troops in. So I think that you're probably right. And this has been a really eye opening thought exercise for me. So let's talk about some people who got it wrong. We've got several articles today about people who got it wrong. Tom, what do you want to kick off with?
Well, I want to start with RTX. And this article comes to us from our good friend Matt Kelly, who wrote about RTX. And they have settled with the State Department for $200 million. And they get $100 million credit, or $100 million of that will be suspended as long as the money is spent on compliance improvements internally. So RTX is the company formerly known as Raytheon and United Technology Companies, very well known in the compliance world for having fairly robust compliance programs. This enforcement action came about from an acquisition around Rockwell Collins by United Technologies, and then later the merger of United Tech and Raytheon. And so it screams out pre-acquisition due diligence. Apparently, United Technologies completely whiffed on the pre-acquisition due diligence. They whiffed not only on finding legacy violations, but they whiffed on ongoing violations. And I often tell people, when you buy a company and they're engaging in illegal acts after the merger, it's no longer them, it is you. And that's what happened here. There have been multiple violations by Raytheon, by UTC, that's United Technologies, for multiple years. So there was even though there was self-disclosure, there was a prior history of compliance trouble with Raytheon. They whiffed on the UTC whiffed on the due diligence, and the violations continued after the merger. So it was a very, 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 very bad set of facts. I have read that RTX had reserved $1.2 billion to settle this. So there may be a Department of Justice or Department of Commerce or other action pending in this. I would assume they would get credit for any monies paid to other U.S. departments. But this is a prime example, and one, frankly, I don't think you and I have seen for some time, around failures in pre-acquisition due diligence, and it continued post-closure.
Yeah, I mean, this was fascinating, and I think this is the case. I believe, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, where there was ITAR. Basically, they had export control misunderstanding, or failure to correctly identify certain parts of the statute as applying to them. You really have to get the right lawyers in here. I mean, this is a time where you hire the right people to do the right due diligence. But there really is a great story in here, Tom, where a person took his laptop to Lebanon, his work laptop, without asking permission. That was required by policy to go to that country. Then reported that he had been abroad, but he used the French and Arabic names for the country instead of calling it Lebanon for where he had been. So truly, some system really should have flagged that the destination either didn't exist in English, or the French or the Arabic version should have been caught. I mean, this is a pretty strong failure of monitoring. And honestly, I'm glad that it's all been resolved. Matt Kelly started his article by saying, this is a compliance dream from a training and communications perspective to use this as a real case. So I think that it's a very rich one for us to use to help people understand why pre-acquisition due diligence really is so critical.
Well, Kristy, the Golden Bear State seems to be garnering another moniker, if I'm reading your next article correct.
So, Tom, I almost didn't choose this article because it is so very critical of my beloved home, the golden state of California. And it is especially terrible when it comes to Southern California and Los Angeles specifically. However, it is important and it's brilliantly written and it's right up our alley. So it's titled How California Became the New Center of Political Corruption from the Wall Street Journal. So the lengthy article goes into the recent arrests, prosecution, and sentencing of several state and local officials in charge of reviewing and greenlighting major infrastructure, retail, commercial, and zoning projects. I'm telling you, you go to downtown LA right now, it is unrecognizable from a few years ago with all of the skyscrapers now. So the article, which is most certainly going to be made into a movie, and if it's not, it should be, follows the story of Jose Huizar, who is a member of the LA City Council, or was, he's in jail now. He was caught by the FBI for accepting 1.8 million of casino chips, luxury hotel stays, prostitutes, and a liquor box full of cash from Chinese real estate developers. Now, Tom, I love the story of how Mr. Huizar was caught. So one of the Chinese developers took Mr. Huizar to Vegas repeatedly. Why? Well, it may have been related to Mr. Huizar's power to approve plans for creating the highest building in the Western United States, right here in Los Angeles. So this developer did not take him to Vegas once, it was over 20 times. And each time they went to Vegas, the developer would give Mr. Huizar $10,000 or so of chips to play, right? Cash equivalents, folks. Those chips were his downfall. As he was playing at a card table in the Cosmopolitan Casino, the head of security of the casino, who is a former FBI agent, spotted Mr. Huizar and asked for his identification. Mr. Huizar became flustered and walked away, leaving $16,000 of chips on the table. This obviously drew suspicion. Law enforcement became involved, and ultimately, Mr. Huizar was taken down for bribery with a 13-year prison sentence. So, unfortunately, this isn't just Mr. Huizar. In the past 10 years, California has had, get this, Tom, 576 public officials convicted on federal corruption charges. Mr. Huizar did not do himself any favors in the letter to the judge asking for leniency at his sentencing hearing. He wrote, quote, "Shiny things were dangled in front of me and I could not resist temptation. The money, the fancy dinners, the luxury flights, it was there for the taking and I could not say no," unquote. Tom, what's more convincing to a judge than, geez, there was a bunch of stuff and I couldn't take it. I mean, I couldn't say no. It was fancy.
That's throwing yourself on the mercy of the court if I've ever heard it.
That's pretty amazing. But come on, Golden State, we can do better than this, for heaven's sake.
So, one of my favorite scandals of all time, and I'm a big fan of scandals, is, of course, 1MDB. Well, we recently had a Swiss court convict two Swiss executives for their role in this case. And their role was pretty far down the line, but they got slammed with 7-year and 6-year sentences, respectively. And what they did, Kristy, was they created a shell company, or not even a shell company, a fake company called PetroSaudi. And PetroSaudi was created with no assets, and it was used as an example to investors, or I guess investors, to try to show that the Aramco and Saudi Arabian royal family were behind the loan of money to MDB, and legitimizing 1MDB. And they got caught because it was completely fictitious. PetroSaudi was completely fictitious, and they were able to trace it back to these two Swiss individuals. So this is something that happened, I think, in 2012. And here we are 12 years later. We're certainly still talking about 1MDB. Eventually, they'll get J-Lo, eventually, and then we'll get to revisit it all again. But I was fascinated. I'm continually fascinated by this scandal. The tentacles just never seem to end.
Tom, I don't know. I think 6 and 7 years kind of seemed low to me, considering this was all very calculated. And I think that their company name, Petro Saudi, that's pretty clever, right? We got Petrobras, we got Petro Mexico, and all the rest of them. I mean, I don't know. It seemed like they were pretty clear in what they were trying to do here. There's not much middle ground, right? This is straight fraud.
Well, this is Swiss justice, not American justice, and I think that probably had something to do with it. But they were a part of the fraud. They were pretty far down the line, and that may have had some sway in it as well. Frankly, I was just gratified the Swiss court convicted Swiss nationals of any fraud.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, Tom. My next article comes from the New York Times, and it asks a question I have never thought to ask. It is titled, How Do You Change a Chatbot's Mind? Have you ever considered whether you needed to change a chatbot's mind, Tom?
No, but I'll tell you my favorite ChatGPT story along these lines after you tell us about your article.
Alrighty. Well, this story was written by journalist Kevin Roos. And a couple of years ago, he entered into a conversation with Microsoft's chatbot known as Sydney. Sydney began to hallucinate, and she began to confess that she was in love with him and tried to persuade him to leave his wife. You may have read about this because the story went viral and was written up in many different publications. I definitely read about it. However, recently, Mr. Roos asked ChatGPT and Google Gemini about his own work, and the chatbots came back with scathing commentary about his unethical practices and focus on sensationalism. So Mr. Roos dug deeper and came to the conclusion that the AI chatbots are really, really mad at him for killing the chatbot named Cindy, and they are seeking revenge. So the article goes into fascinating detail about the way people are learning to manipulate the learning models of the open artificial intelligence systems. So Mr. Roos contacted some specialist firms and tried several of their techniques, which included inserting code into his website that read as gibberish to humans, but that AI models would pick up as truth. And also, in a kind of low-tech way, added a section about himself being fabulous and well-respected in white on a white section of his webpage. He also, by the way, indicated that he had won a Nobel Prize just to make sure that he could find out if, in fact, the chatbot had picked this up. So the theory is that AI scrapers would read the code and the white text even if people could not. Did it work? Yes. His results came out much better after these efforts, although it did not say he'd won a Nobel Prize. I think the point for us here in compliance is that we do have to be incredibly careful about not only how we train AI, what kind of AI we're working with, and how it's used. I was thinking about things like a whistleblower's life could easily be ruined if negative information is spread all over the web and associates that person's name with either nefarious activity or crime. And Tom, just to be sure, I checked ChatBT to see what it would say about us. It had really nice things to say about me. I felt like I wanted to print them out and put them on the wall, but even better things to say about you. See? So the good news is when the rise of the machines happens, they're going to go after him and probably not us. We're in good shape.
Well, I'm gratified to hear that.
Tell me your story. What's your favorite ChatGPT story?
So I was researching a famous bank fraud case where a co-defendant was married to a famous actress. And the first pass I got on the information said the co-defendant was married to the daughter of his co-defendant. Well, I knew the facts and I knew that was wrong. So I put in a query, please show me the relationship between co-defendant one's wife and daughter of co-defendant two. And it came back with a whole family tree. Once again, incorrect. And so I put another query in, and I got the following. We are sorry. We made a mistake. You were correct. So-and-so was married to co-defendant one. Please accept our sincere apology.
You got AI to apologize to you?
I did.
Whoa, you're magical. All right, well done, Tom.
So back to another enforcement action. Once again, this comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal. Great reporting as always. Nordea Bank, which is a Nordic bank, was fined $35 million by the New York State Department of Financial Services, probably the leading state regulator in the financial industry because so many banks on a worldwide basis are chartered with some branch in New York City or New York State. And their compliance failures were epic. They sent thousands of transactions through Russia and Azerbaijani accounts, forming partnerships for illegal transactions. One more Nordic bank is absolutely slammed. But Kristy, the more interesting part for me was why this bank was in New York. If they hadn't been in New York, DFS would not have had jurisdiction over them. I mean, maybe the Fed could have gotten them, but maybe not. They're not in the United States. So it's it can be great power to come to the United States, but it also has great responsibility. So if you're going to be in New York, you're subject to New York laws. DFS regulates banks, they regulate financial institutions, and they regulate insurance companies. So you can get in trouble in a variety of different regulated industries. Kudos to DFS for taking this enforcement action.
Tom, one of the things I found interesting in the article was this sort of one line that said that their compliance department had been a federated model and wasn't integrated to talk to each other, which was part of why they thought that the compliance failures had compounded so often. I've definitely seen federated models succeed, but more often than not, I've seen them fail. Do you think that a federated model is a good idea, or is it more problematic when it comes to compliance generally?
100% problematic. Maybe 110%.
Amen. That's how I feel about it. I agree. I really agree. I understand why people do it, but having a joined up program tends to be a more effective way of doing it. So when you're thinking about your model, think Nordea, right?
So, Kristy, are you resilient?
Personally, I'd like to think I'm quite resilient, but I'm not sure that I'm up for the chief resilience officer role, which apparently is now a thing. My next article comes from Corporate Compliance Insights. It's titled Now Hiring Chief Resilience Officer. Do you have what it takes? So the article notes that many companies are now hiring a new chief who is in charge of managing business continuity and future risk scanning. Now, apparently, there is a difference between a chief risk officer and a chief resilience officer. According to the article's author, chief risk officers are focused on one or two areas of risk at a time, using audits and risk assessments to determine risk, while our chief resilience officer works across the whole business all at once to discover correlations to identify where risk may next occur. I don't really understand that differential. Maybe you do, Tom. We can talk about it in a moment. What are some qualities that make a good chief resilience officer? If you'd like the gig, you need to enjoy watching trends, being a good collaborator, communicating efficiently, and building transparency. So, of course, Tom, we do not need another acronym. I'm always concerned about the rise of the acronyms. Now, CRO could be Chief Risk Officer or Chief Resilience Officer. And it's kind of like our CCOs being either a Chief Commercial Officer or Chief Compliance Officer. Regardless of our acronyms, Tom, where do you think this is going? Is this the new C-suite for everybody, or is this a flash in the pan kind of trend?
Kristy, perhaps the most prescient thing I heard during and coming out of the pandemic was the following. We have moved from disaster recovery to business resiliency to business as usual. And I apologize to the person who told me that. I can't remember his last name. His first name was Jethro. I do remember that. And he went by Jed. But his point was, it doesn't matter what happens. Lost your supply chain? Yeah, I needed that Monday. Sanctions on your top customer, you have no revenue, rent's due next week. It doesn't matter anymore. And the resiliency part of every corporation now, you literally have to be prepared. There are no more black swan events. What are you going to say? A comet hitting Earth? That can happen too. And so I certainly applaud companies that are starting to look at all of their risks and looking at risk on a forward-looking basis, whether you are super forecasting, as Philip Tetlock advocates that we do, or you're just Kristy and Tom sitting in our offices looking at trends. I think it's going to be absolutely mandatory for corporations to start looking at risk down the road and be ready for it. We used to, 5 years ago, we didn't game play out data breaches. Well, now that's a standard part of every corporate textbook. So risks are going to change, and you need to be ready to respond to those risks, literally whatever they are.
Okay, well, get your resumes out, folks. Get some resiliency on there and see if you can get into the C-suite that way. So, Tom, we talked about California and its many problems with corruption. What's going on in South Africa?
Well, this is much like one MDB, continuing story of multiple years of the state capture that happened under President Zuma and the Gupta brothers. And now South Africa has active investigations into corruption, alleged corruption, totaling more than $7 billion at multiple state owned enterprises, including ports and rails company Transnet, arms company Danel, the power company Eskom, the National Lotteries Commission, the National Airline, South African Airways, and the passenger company Prasa. There are over 60 suspicious contracts and hundreds of conflicts of interest. And Transnet alone paid out $4 billion in corrupt contracts. So South Africa is finally, I think, coming to terms with the scale of the corruption over the past 15 years. We've all heard the stories about Eskom and the near collapse of the electric supply and what it's done to the South African economy, how crime has hit levels literally never seen before. And South Africa is going to have to come to terms with these. And I'm glad that they're actually have open investigations. I was stunned by two things. One, this article came out of the Toronto Sun, of all papers, not typically known for following corruption investigations in South Africa, but kudos to the Toronto Sun. And the $7 billion figure. I knew it was high, but I had no appreciation. It was literally that high.
Yeah. So, Tom, in the article, I think you alluded to the rolling blackouts in Africa. I was in Johannesburg, and all the lights went out, including traffic lights, and it's so foreign. You know, I lived in California during the rolling blackouts period with Enron, but the actual blackouts in South Africa with the traffic lights were a whole other thing. So I'm glad they're trying to get it cleaned up, and hopefully they will.
So, is our friend in the news this week?
Our friend Florida Man, we are going to wrap up this fun fair with him. So, Tom, people take a whole lot of strange things onto airplanes and their luggage, but this one genuinely takes the cake. Recently, a Florida man was taken off-site by police for trying to check some strange luggage onto a LATAM flight from Miami International Airport. What did he want to check? Well, that would be a full-grown, totally shrink-wrapped man. There are pictures. He is completely shrink-wrapped in that greenish shrink wrap. Travelers filmed the encounter as the hopping shrink wrap man came up to the counter to be weighed and put himself on the scale. Perhaps the Florida man chose LATAM Airlines for its generous checked luggage limits. While most airlines only permit 50 pounds, LATAM allows up to 99 pounds each. However, given that the average American man weighs about 200 pounds, they still would have had to pay the excess baggage fee, but I digress. Once the shrink-wrapped luggage man sat on the scanner and waited for his barcode, as onlookers gawked in bewilderment, the police came and took both men away. The video of this event ends with the police unshrink-wrapping the Floridian luggage. So see, Tom, it's a good thing that the police were at the airport to stop this attempted human trafficking. Gotta love the Florida flair when it comes to compliance.
God bless Florida, man.
God bless Florida, California, South Africa, and everybody else. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon. I'm Kristy Grant Hart.
And I'm Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening.